This video is a follow-up to my previous D800 live view magnification and manual focus issue video. In that video, I talked about how the D800 generates its magnified view, particularly its 100% one-to-one pixel view, and how that view is generated by skipping lines on the sensor and creating an interpolated image, which is not nearly as sharp and clear as the one-to-one magnified views as you'd see on the D7000 or on the Canon models such as the 5D Mark II. And I discussed how that interpolation can affect your ability to precisely and critically focus manually within live view. I also talked about how there are certain real-world examples where I found they're not nearly as bad as the example of the cereal box that I showed. And in this video, I want to talk more about that. I want to show you a couple of real live examples of manual focusing under live view. Instead of actually showing you just photographs of the LCD, both from live view and the image preview, I got myself an HDMI portable recorder where now I can actually record the live view feed coming off the camera into a video feed, record that video feed, and then incorporate that into the video that I'm showing you now. That way you'll get to see exactly what I can see via the live view at the full 30 frames per second. And that way you can make your own determination as to how well you can focus for some of the subjects I'm about to show you. I'm going to also show you a technique via the picture controls where you can change the sharpness and the contrast to make it easier to focus, even in the presence of some of those interpolation artifacts. What you're looking at now is the actual live view feed coming off the camera at 30 frames per second. And I'm going to start with the example from the previous video of the cereal box, which represents the worst case of the artifacts that I've seen so far. And you can see as I move the manual focus ring into focus, where you'd expect the letters to really pop into focus, you really never get that pop because there's sort of a waviness to the letters and the lines, and that's again the result of the interpolation where you're not really getting a full one-to-one pixel view of the image, and so you never really get that crisp sharpness that you would use to establish critical focus. And here's an image review of a photograph taken in that same live view session. Here you can see that the images and the lines are a lot crisper than what you saw in that live view feed. To help demonstrate that, I'll switch quickly back and forth between the live view preview and the image review. The live view preview is what you see with the green bounding box. Without the box, that's the actual photograph taken in the image review on the camera. Before I move on to the next example, I want to show you what the cereal box looks like if we boost up the sharpness and the contrast of the picture profile within live view. Like all the other settings of the picture profile, the sharpness and the contrast are previewed in the actual feed you see on the screen. So here you can see that the lines have become sharper, I guess is a term you could use for them. There's certainly more contrast there. But even with the additional contrast and the sharpening, you still don't have those sharp, crisp edges. You just sort of have an exaggeration of the interpolated artifacts you had before. But with that said, I think the sharpening and the contrast boost of the picture control still helps even in this worst case example of the artifacts. And here I'll switch back and forth between the sharpened preview and the unsharpened so you get an idea of how much it's helping for this particular example. Let's move on to another live view focusing example. Here's a more natural scene. Here's a tree that's maybe 100, 150 feet away. There's the full framing to give you an idea of the scope. And through the falling rain, you can see that there's a lot of detail being presented on the LCD and really no artifacts that are visible, at least not to my eye. And so for this particular scene and the type of detail and the frequency of that detail, I really have no trouble whatsoever establishing critical focus. And here's the photograph taken of that same scene. Again, not much detail difference between the photograph and what we saw in the preview. Again, showing that there really aren't any artifacts to speak of here. I didn't have any trouble focusing the scene with the low sharpness and contrast I typically use for my neutral profile, but just for demonstration purposes, here is that same scene with the sharpening and the contrast turned up. And again, I'm turning the manual focus ring in and out of focus just to give you an idea what the transition looks like between the two. And here's a photograph taken with that additional sharpening and contrast in the picture profile. The point I should make is by changing those picture profiles, you're not just changing the preview and live view, you're actually changing the photograph. This doesn't mean much if you shoot RAW because The picture profile is really just a metadata tag that gets ignored by Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop. It's really only used by Nikon's raw utilities. But if you shoot JPEG, you're going to have an issue, because if you shoot with that additional sharpening, it's probably not going to be the image you want. So either you need to switch back and forth between the sharpened and unsharpened, and you can probably do that by utilizing two picture profiles, one which has your sharpening for the focusing and one which has without, that you want to use for the actual photograph. And here's the next example. This is a building that's just behind that tree, so it's about the same distance. And this is a Spanish tile roof. You can see a pigeon's walked into a frame. This is where the artifacts becoming a problem again. There's the framing to give you an idea of the scope. Even when the tiles are in focus, the artifacts still make it appear as if it's really not truly in focus. You can still clearly see the out of focus to in focus transition to know that it's in focus, but it's still not as clear as you'd like it to be. And here's the actual photograph taking that same focus. You can see it's a lot clearer than what we saw in the preview. And I'll switch back and forth here between the preview and the photo to give you an idea of the difference. And here's the next focusing example. This is a piece of lattice much closer, maybe 30 feet away. I have the picture profile sharpening set back to low, along with the contrast back to 0. And you can see it's kind of difficult to get the focus. There isn't much contrast demonstrated on the screen, plus with a little bit of artifacting, it doesn't help. So I'll go ahead and boost up the sharpening and the contrast. And it helps a lot for this particular subject. You can see how the edges come into a lot better focus now. And here's an image taken and reviewed on the LCD. It's a bit clearer than what we saw on the live view feed, even with the sharpening, but it's still, I think, close enough where I was able to establish focus within live view, and the final picture represents what I saw on the live view feed. Here's the next and final example. This is a spigot that's about 3 feet away from the camera. This is with the sharpening and the contrast turned down on the profile. If you look closely, you can actually see the dancing of the diagonals on the feed. Again, I think that's the artifacting coming into play. I'll go ahead and turn up the sharpness and the contrast. And I think even with the artifacting that's being shown for these vertical lines, I was still able to establish pretty precise focus, particularly because the subject is so close. So even if there are interpolated details, there's enough surviving detail there to be able to acquire adequate focus. And here's a photograph taken after the focus was manually established in live view. Again, the clarity of the photo is a lot higher than what we saw in the live view preview. But I think the fact I'm able to take critically sharp photographs after manually focusing demonstrates that even with the shortcomings of the clarity of the live view feed, there's still enough detail there in order to establish critical focus. Well, that about does it for the video. I've done enough experiments with a lot of different focus subjects, even more than what you've seen in the video, I think, to answer all the questions I had as to whether or not the D800's implementation is good enough for focusing. I was most interested in landscape focusing because that's what I intend to use the camera the most for. And I think the different subjects that I've tried, in all cases I was able to establish critical focusing. It didn't look as nice and as clear as I would have liked to have seen it on the live view preview. You didn't get that level of comfort you would normally get on like a 5D Mark II or a D7000. But again, the question is whether or not you can still produce the results you need, produce those critically sharp photographs. And with the D800, even with its current implementation, I think you certainly can. So that's where we stand now. If anything else comes up, or if I find any other interesting ways to maybe work around this or to get a clear preview, I'll certainly share them. But as it stands, I think the subject for me is pretty much closed.